For the second day in a row, Nolan Brooke, the mayor of a provincial town, was in a bad mood. Waking up in the morning, he remembered with irritation the yesterday's conversation with his wife. She complained that their daughter Thora became involved with some bad company, and she began to come home late and even skip classes at school. And this, despite the fact that she was already in her graduating class and she should have been more responsible for her studies. At breakfast, Nolan tried to talk reason into his daughter, but the always compliant Thora showed her character this time. "Daddy, don't talk to me like that. I'm not doing anything bad. I am a volunteer. Do you understand? It's a helpful and necessary activity. Somebody has to help the poor animals." The father tried to explain to Thora that she needed to spend more time studying now, and besides, people of their rank didn't do this kind of thing. Seeing that persuasion didn't work, Nolan tried to pressure her as usual by threatening to take away the girl's pocket money. But it did not work as expected, and finally the conversation ended up with Thora grabbing her backpack and running out of the house. After a ruined breakfast, Nolan went to work figuring out what to do. Of course, he could order security and they would quickly find and bring the girl home. But Thora was already 17 years old, and the man feared that such measures could ruin their relationship forever. Nolan, glancing irritably at his watch, rushed down the corridor of City Hall. His subordinates were coming out of all the offices, trying to report on some problems or to get documents to sign on the way. He stopped abruptly in front of his office, gave the order to leave all the papers at his secretary's desk, and disappeared behind the door. Once he was in silence, he sighed with relief, but soon the door opened and his secretary, Ruby, walked in. She nodded toward the visitor's chair. Nolan followed her gaze and immediately frowned. There was an elderly man, about 80 years old, in old-fashioned and neat and clean clothes, sitting in the chair. He was leaning on a cane with his hand, and on his lap lay a folder. The mayor looked at the secretary, perplexed, not understanding how the elderly man had managed to get into his office past the guards. It was as if Ruby had read her boss's mute question and shrugged her shoulders. When she arrived at work in the morning, the old man was already here. Nolan felt a wave of anger come over him. He had so much to do, and this old man probably showed up with some nonsense. But remembering that elections were coming up, Nolan decided to calm down and not to aggravate relations with the voter. "I'm sorry, but the citizen's visit on personal issues is on Wednesday, and by appointment. I can't break the rules," explained Nolan to the elderly man. "I know, but everything is reserved for months ahead, and my question is urgent." Nolan got angry again. Seeing the change in the boss's face, Ruby immediately rushed to the door to call security. But Nolan sighed dolefully and, waving his hand, made a sign to the visitor to come into his office. The elderly man got up and, leaning on his cane, came into the office. A surprised Ruby shrugged her shoulders and closed the door behind them tightly. Nolan sat down at the table and prepared to listen. The old man fidgeted in his chair for a long time, trying to get comfortable, and finally began his story. He talked long and confusedly about his sick, disabled wife, the lack of access ramps for wheelchairs, and the fact that the elderly people were the most unprotected part of the society. The elderly man spoke in general phrases and still could not say the heart of his question. The mayor's stomach rumbled, and he remembered that because of the quarrel with his daughter, he had not had a proper breakfast. He couldn't stand it any longer, so Nolan got up from his seat and walked silently out into the waiting room. "Ruby, I'm going to lunch. Make sure this old man is gone by the time I return. Tell him to write down his request. Otherwise, I'll go crazy listening to him." Ruby nodded hastily and rushed into the office, while the mayor hurried into the dining room. There he enjoyed a steamed trout with vegetable garnish, drank it all with a fragrant cappuccino. At last, he felt that his anger and anxiety for his daughter was slowly fading. He was ready to begin his work. But when he got to his office, he froze in a daze. The same elderly man was sitting in his chair, spreading out some papers on Nolan's desk, and Ruby was standing at his back, looking at the papers in interest. "What is going on? Why is he still here?" almost hissed Nolan. Ruby started to make excuses, but the elderly man looked at the mayor and uttered, "You should listen to me, Nolan." Anger, Nolan jumped up to the table and looked at the papers, then slowly sat down in the chair next to him. For a minute, he sat with an absent look, and then suddenly knelt down in front of the elderly man. He tearfully began to apologize to him and promised that he would do anything for him that he asked. Ruby did not understand what was going on with the boss, but Nolan understood everything perfectly. He realized who that elderly man was and mentally moved back 30 years to the time of his childhood. When Nolan was 15, an unfortunate thing happened to him. A severe heart defect after the flu literally struck the athlete and honors student off his feet. The boy could neither walk nor breathe normally, and no medication helped. His condition was so bad that none of the doctors took him to surgery, understanding that he would not survive. The last person whom the boy's inconsolable parents reached out to was an elderly cardiac surgeon at a small state hospital. He was the only one who decided to take the risk. The doctor spent a whole month preparing the boy for surgery, and then, after standing for 10 hours on the operating table, he did the nearly impossible. When Nolan fully recovered after 6 months, his parents decided to thank the doctor, but they did not find him in the hospital. As it turned out, after the tension he had undergone, the already elderly man had a heart attack, and his wife took him away to the sea after medical treatment. Over time, his story was forgotten, and now the same doctor came to Nolan with some important request. But he did not have time to listen to his savior. Nolan was still kneeling in front of the elderly man, asking for forgiveness, and he suddenly smiled and looked kindly at the repentant man. "Never mind. Stop it. Nolan, I'm glad you're doing well," he said, and then briefly and to the point, he explained what had made him go to the mayor. As it turned out, he was not asking for himself, as Nolan thought at first. The elderly man was living out his life in a nursing home that was full of people in wheelchairs, and there were no conditions for a full-fledged life. Some of the residents could not even go out for a walk due to the lack of special ramps, and the nursing staff consisted mostly of women who were unable to carry heavy wheelchairs. Nolan smiled and promised to fix everything within a month. He wanted to do something else for his savior, but the elderly man only shook his head. "I don't need anything else. Please understand, I didn't come to ask myself. I came to ask for other people, he muttered. After that, he got up heavily and headed for the door. Always remain human, Nolan. Your heart was in my hands, and now you are responsible for the hearts of others. Always remember that. The elderly doctor had left long ago, but Nolan was still sitting there looking at his medical history sheet, left by the elderly man, on the table. Then he suddenly came to his senses and called his daughter. Late that evening, tired but satisfied, Nolan drove home. Thora, smiling in her sleep, was dozing in the front seat, and an old shabby dog and a one-eyed cat were snoozing in their carriers in the back seat. Nolan proposed to take them home. His daughter was delighted. Anticipating his wife's protests, Nolan called her and arranged everything. He also asked her to prepare a small room in the house, saying that soon they would have a guest. Nolan was determined to go to the nursing home tomorrow and do everything possible to get the elderly doctor to agree to move in with them. Narrated by Deirdre Eby.